The UK has been using the first past the post voting system since the 19th century. But does it still work? Is it providing fair results?
And I led a party in 2015 that got 4 million votes and 1 seat in the House of Commons. I mean, what a complete and utter nonsense that is.
Yet the vast majority of votes up and down the land simply do not count.
The UK is not a democracy.
There's no doubt that first past the post does lead to strategic voting.
Has this outdated voting system created too many problems?
At least 430 migrants crossed the English Channel to the UK yesterday, according to the Home.
Groomed, trafficked, abused, raped.
Good evening. Gordon Brown is among a group of 13 cabinet ministers whose expense claims are being reviewed.
Mrs. Beckett, are you going to pay back £72,000 that you've taken?
No, I'm not.
Ordinary people have got to pay for everything out of their salary and wages.
Or is the UK ready for change?
Widespread miscarriage of justice in UK history.
Well, our stance is to remain first past the post.
First past the post of proportional representation.
I think our system is becoming outdated, so I think there's a good argument for looking at a different system.
In the United Kingdom, our population is becoming more diverse every day, with many different cultures, beliefs, colours and even backgrounds. But let's think about it. Is our current voting system, which has been around for centuries, truly effective at representing all these different voices? Many people feel like their opinions don't matter because of this old, outdated, first-past-the-post system. Shouldn't everyone's vote be just as important in a system that shows what modern Britain really looks like? Shouldn't we listen to every person's idea when we're deciding our future together? So is it time to change how we vote and switch to proportional representation? The first-past-the-post voting system is straightforward. Voters choose one candidate from a list of options, and the candidate with the most votes wins. It's like a race, where the first person to cross the finish line wins, regardless of whether they have a majority of the votes. Each constituency or area elects one candidate, and whoever gets the most votes wins in that area, then becomes Member of Parliament. This system is simple to understand and can lead to situations where a candidate wins even if most people didn't vote for them. Like these examples here. These are the results of the 2019 election for Scott Benton of the Conservative Party. As you can clearly see, the number of votes cast, more people voted for the other parties and candidates in yellow than the Conservative in blue, who won the seat with a minority of the vote. Same here with the Labour MP Cat Smith. As you can see in yellow, more people voted for the other parties and candidates by more than 6.4% compared to the winning candidate Cat Smith, which raises the question about a corrupt, unjust system, or if we was to use a more inclusive system, where over 80% of developed democracies around the world use proportional representation. This is where the number of seats a political party gets in Parliament reflects the percentage of votes they receive in the election. So if a party was to get 30% of the votes, they should ideally get a 30% of the seats in Parliament. This unbiased system precisely reflects the overall preferences of the voters, regardless of where they live in the UK. Here are the results of the 2019 general election. On the left are the current results, and on the right are the results if we was to use the PR system. When did the organisation start and why?
Yeah, thanks, Craig. So, Make Votes Matter, we're a political pressure group and we're campaigning to introduce some form of PR in the House of Commons. We're cross-party, so we're fully inclusive, so cross-party or no party, and including all political views and opinions. But we're just campaigning for electoral reform and some form of PR in the House of Commons.
What is your organisation doing to make people aware of a different voting system, and have you noticed a change?
Yeah, thanks, Craig. We have, certainly in the time that I've been with the organisation, there is much more interest in it. So many of our groups do street stalls on a weekly basis. They might be leafleting, they might be talking to people. We have a fantastic speaker training program. So people are going out into organisations, and we've definitely noticed in the last 18 months, more people are saying politics is broken, it isn't working. Why is that? What can we do? And when we get into conversation with people, we can just tell them more about the system, and we can say why we think it's broken and what steps we could take to fix the system. And just to show that in Parliament it's not representing our views at the moment. And we've got the two parties, the two dominant parties, the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, and it alternates between their power sharing. But it's not blue or red. Our views might be in the middle, they might be to the left, or they might be to the right, and that's not representing our views in society.
What are the differences between the first past the post and the PR system?
So here in the UK, we use a system called first past the post to elect our MPs in the House of Commons. It's an old style of voting system, which is carried on in some of the old British colonies, but it's not a modern form of democracy. And most modern forms of democracy have changed to some form of PR. And in fact, here in Europe, the only other country to use first past the post is Belarus.
Commissioner shut down the European Parliament because he wanted to get his own way. It is horrendous when we have proportional representation at the EU level, not in the UK, which means millions of votes simply do not count here.
Of course they count. Every single vote counts the same.
In the last election, 68%
of votes didn't count in the last election.
Hi, Femi. So what motivated you to educate people about the voting system?
Because I knew from my own studies, from my own professional background, that the truth was simply not getting to people. I knew that if I didn't do something, nobody would. It was that strong sense of there is nobody at the wheel. Because, and bear in mind, in 2016, I had 20 followers on Twitter. When I got really desperate, I couldn't call up BBC News. I couldn't speak to hundreds of thousands of followers. I had to go buy a t-shirt from Primark, and I stood in the center of the Birmingham Bull Ring with a question and I wrote EU questions, just ask. And I was just basically waiting for people to come talk to me, because I knew that we couldn't count on the people that were actually in charge of things. And it's gone from that to 400,000 followers now, column in the Independent, and that only happens because of the vacancy up top. It's the fact that we know that the people who are actually running this show are doing it wrong. And the more we've gone through the kind of politics that we've seen over the last few years, the more that everybody can see they're doing it wrong. And so a lot of people, especially young people, have this feeling of, oh, but no, the people that have been in this game for a long time, they know what they're doing, they'll handle it. That feeling has very much died. And so everybody is increasingly being aware that they do have the right to step in.
So what's the best way to get this message across to people?
In terms of how you shift that conversation on, how do you get somebody talking about it? How do you make the media listen to it? You have to put it in the most blunt and, sorry to say it, sensational terms that you possibly can. That means saying the simple fact of the UK is not a democracy. And that works for a number of reasons. One, it's factually accurate. If you in terms of depending on your definition of democracy, if you know that pretty much every election that we have, a party with only a minority of the vote gets a majority of seats in parliament, then that means the majority of votes that went to the other parties can't actually affect policy because the minority party has a controlling majority. So if the majority of votes have no effect on our democratic processes, then that cannot be a democracy. One would think that the majority of votes would be pretty crucial to any democracy. So making that point, convincing somebody, no, the UK is not, on balance, a democracy, will get that conversation started. It will get the media's attention. If there's lots of people suddenly saying we don't believe the UK is a democracy, that makes waves.
So what interactions have you had with members of public?
A couple of days ago, and someone, I think he was 23-year-old in the gym, and came up to me, he spotted me off TikTok, and I got to talking to him, and he was absolutely depressed. And the point where he said, "Oh my God, that makes me really, really hopeful," was when I told him about PR. I explained to him, look, if you look back at every single election since World War II, other than 1955, 1959, and 2015, the majority of votes have gone to parties that are to the left of the Tories. The majority of votes have gone to Labour, the SNP, Lib Dems, Green. That's who we are on balance as a country. That's not a partisan issue, that's simply a matter of fact. And so if there was a voting system where everybody's vote counted equally, that would be the balance of power from now moving forward. And when he's looking at what it was, what kind of politics we're seeing now, and when he's looking at the kind of things we're seeing like today, if you paid attention to the kind of news, the things that Rishi Sunak has been coming out with, that's our unelected prime minister. That gave him a lot of hope compared to where we are now.
Clearly, this system is now bankrupt. It just doesn't work. And where's the incentive? I mean, if you're a socialist living in Isha, where's the incentive on a rainy Thursday afternoon to go and vote when you know there's no chance of your vote counting for anything? A lot of work was done by this. Blair said we should rethink the system back in the 90s. The Jenkins Commission came up with a proposal for AV+, which means 2 ballot papers. So wherever you live, you still get the man or woman that represents the town, which I agree is very important. But the second ballot paper lets you express a view, and any big view in this country would have representation in Parliament. Incidentally, Germany has been running on that system since 1945 in permanent coalition, and nobody would argue that Germany had been run badly.
And people are very, very fed up with feeling like they've been forced to vote for the lesser of two evils, forced to vote how they didn't want to vote, but because they're worried about the first past the post system. And the fact is, this building behind us, Westminster, the last significant reform here was women getting the vote in 1918.
I've arranged an interview with Labour councillor Danny Smith to discuss what he feels should be done about our current voting system. Critics argue that the first-past-the-post system often leads to a two-party system. Do you see this as a positive or a negative outcome?
I would agree with the critics. I think at the moment, the current system, the two-party system, doesn't work, because I think what ends up happening is that these parties end up kind of being in a race to emulate each other, and I think that's what we're seeing a little bit at the moment, to be honest.
Do you think your party will stand a stronger chance of success under the PR system?
So I'm a member of the Labour Party. I'm a Labour town councillor. I think with regards to the Labour Party, I think their electoral success would improve in the way that they would probably be able to form a government more often than they do now. With regards to actual winning of seats and winning of votes, I think that's more down to the competence and the appeal of the party rather than the system. But I think, being able to form a government would be more likely for the Labour Party under a more proportional system. That's not why I advocate for proportional representation, though, to be honest. I think with regards to electoral success, I think every party deserves to have the success that their votes bring them. So, if someone ends up getting over 50% of the vote, they should be able to form a government regardless. And then for the smaller parties, their success should depend on the amount of votes that they get, rather than having, quite a high proportion of the vote, as much as 3 or 4 million votes and quite a high percentage of the vote, but getting nothing or very little for it. So with regards to that kind of fairness, that's a reason why I would advocate for a proportional representation, but having my party as being more successful probably isn't as much a reason.
Do you think it would encourage more people if we were to use a more proportional representation to vote?
That's a difficult question. I think overall, countries with a higher turnout generally do have more proportional systems. I think it's about the highest turnout of 8 of about the top 10 countries, I think, that have proportional representation. I think it's difficult to speculate on that one, I would say. But what I do think is that people would value their vote a lot more, and that would hopefully lead to more engagement and more higher turnout.
The trust between politicians and the public is at an all-time low at the moment. For a change like this, would it be the best to let the people decide in a national referendum on changing the voting system, or the politicians?
I think a bit of both. I think letting the public decide via a referendum for something that can be quite complicated. I think it's about both the idea of proportional representation and the system to use as well. So I think a little bit of both. I don't think a referendum to implement proportional representation as a concept would be particularly useful. I think that's probably more going to be a case of getting a party or parties to put proportional representation in their manifesto, which has happened in the past but not been delivered, which is unfortunate, and then have the people vote for that manifesto and for the parties that put PR in their manifesto. And then I would say probably from there, maybe a referendum could be more useful for the type of system that we use in a general election, because different systems, different ways of voting have different benefits and slightly different drawbacks as well. And it'd be quite interesting to see what the public thought would be the most important things to them in a referendum on the actual system used.
After speaking to Councillor Danny Smith, who's in support of changing the voting system, I now want to speak to a politician who's not so keen. So I travel back down to the Fylde Coast for a Zoom call with Defence Secretary MP Ben Wallace, who is down in Portcullis House in Westminster. At the Labour Party conference, 80% of Labour members voted for their party to push for changing the first past the post to proportional representation. What's the Conservative Party's stance on it?
Well, our stance is to remain first past the post. I was the first Conservative, I think, ever to be elected under PR to the 1999 Scottish Parliament elections. I was on the list system. And Scottish Parliament is a good example. It's not just about voting for a change of the system. There are PR systems and there are PR systems. So when New Labour designed the Scottish Parliament PR system, it was held as a system that would never allow one party to dominate. Well, unless you've been asleep for the last 14 years, you'll have noticed that the SNP completely dominate the Scottish Parliament, including having the Speaker, because ultimately that PR system didn't produce the result they wanted. So our system is to try and keep first past the post as much as possible.
Do you think the first past the post system silences millions of voters in elections? And do you think the PR system would open doors for smaller parties? I kind of know you've answered that one.
Well, so I don't think it silences people, because in a two system or three system party, the big parties tend to be a broad church. So In the Conservative Party, you have Brexiteers and Remainers, you have strong environmentalists, and you have a small number of climate skeptics, you have authoritarian, and you have libertarian. And in the Labour Party, you have everyone from Tony Blair to Jeremy Corbyn, right? So they are broad churches with lots of voices. And what it does allow you is where you agree to come together to deliver a change, and whether you disagree, you can make your point and bring a different type of coalition in action. So I don't think people's voices are drowned out. But I also think, it goes back to my beginning point, is the point of an electoral system is fairness, but also accountability. And I don't think, I think PR gives little parties more power and less accountability. It's really hard. Let's say Labour won under PR and they needed 25% more MPs from somebody else to make it over the line of a majority. They make that 25% up of 3 or 4 different parties. You and I would be powerless to say, actually, I don't like that. Why are the Greens in our government, or why is the UKIP in our party, in our government? And if you ever saw the advert made by Rick Mail against the referendum campaign, it was a very funny advert, but it was a political broadcast. But what they were saying in it was, what also happens when you have a multiple coalition is no one takes responsibility. When you say to me, but hang on, Ben, in your manifesto, you said free school transport. Under PR and under coalitions, people constantly say, look, I really wanted to do it. I really did, but our coalition partners wouldn't let us. And that happens all the time. And in the Scottish elections in 1999, the Liberal Democrats stood on abolishing tuition fees. The phrases from the leader at the time is, I won't swap my principles for ministerial mondeo. That was his phrase, Jim Wallace. 2 days after the election to the Scottish Parliament, Lib Dems and the Labour Party formed the Scottish government, and tuition fees stayed in place. And that's the nature. So I think they're less accountable PR systems, but might be more fair in reflecting votes. And that's a balance we're going to have to make. And I think, whatever I think about my government and the Labour Party, come this year, people know exactly what to do to get rid of my government. There'll be no ifs or buts, as there were in 97, or there was in 2019 when people didn't like Jeremy Corbyn. There's no ifs or buts. Then you get a government. You can hold it to account.
Do you think it would encourage more people if we use proportional representation instead of first past the post? With the tactical,
I think it is the case that in PR, more people think on one side that they have a voice, that they end up with delegates in a parliament. There are more parties represented. But those very same people can get equally disappointed when they are either excluded from power, or indeed they can't get rid of the other parties in power because of the structure. Now, I'll give you an example of that. The German FPD party, which is effectively the Liberal Entrepreneurs Party in Germany, have never had more than about 6% of the vote in Germany. They've been in power as part of the government for something like 40 years since the war. So you could put it another way, 95% of the German electorate specifically don't want the FPD to be in power. They go out, when they go and vote on voting day, they vote, 95% vote not to have the FPD in power. But under PR, they get them in power. And then it's really hard to get rid of them.
Last question, so I don't want to keep you too long because I know you're a busy man. The trust between politicians and the public is quite low at the moment. For a big constitutional change, would it be better to let the people decide on a national referendum if they were to change the voting system?
Yes, and we did have one in 2011 or 12. We had a national referendum on the PR system, and the first past the post won by, I think, 72%.
It was up against the AV system.
Oh yeah, but that's PR. Right? I mean, the Lib Dems got to choose what the different systems were, but therein you're going straight to the problem of the PR. Everybody's got a different view of which PR system is the best one. I mean, I've never met a group of PR campaigners who all agree on exactly the best system, which is why right across Europe you see different systems. You see different systems in the Scottish system compared to the London mayoralty, I think. You know, they're different. And that's the problem. It's not as simple as first past versus PR. It's first past versus which system are you talking about? But ultimately, we should have a referendum on it, yeah, if people want to do it. If you're going to change it. Now, I wouldn't propose changing it. We did have a referendum in 2010, 2011. It was a pretty hefty defeat for AV, but, you know, there's other methods. But it didn't sound like the British public were in love with PR for government. And history also shows that the new winning party suddenly isn't too keen to be voting itself out of power. So if Labour do win the election with a big majority, and I suspect they won't be that keen to rush to give it up.
The number of votes cast in favour of no is 1,000,000.
On the night, turnout was low and change didn't happen. Britain elected to keep its old system by 2-1.
The inability to link public frustration with MPs' expenses with a political system which is as clapped out as ours is, was then and remains a kind of failure. And of course, you had the great irony that some of the people who were most ardent in shining a spotlight on the MPs' expenses scandals, the Daily Telegraph and others, were also the most ardent in stopping any change to the political system. And to this day, we haven't broken that stranglehold.
Critics argue that the first-past-the-post system often leads to a two-party system. Do you see this as a positive or a negative outcome?
There's no doubt that first past the post does lead to strategic voting or tactical voting. I see it in my own constituency. So I've stood for election in Lancaster and Fleetwood 3 times. And one time that sort of stands out in my mind is the member of the Liberal Democrats who told me that he was voting for me to make sure the Tories didn't get in. So there's someone whose political ideology is very different to mine, but we kind of had united on a kind of almost a kind of, but we really don't want the Tories to win, so we're going to vote this way. Now, I'm not that comfortable, if I might be honest, about taking votes from people who I know don't really want to vote for me, but they're doing it in a tactical way. I'd feel like politics was better if people voted for what they actually believed in and had that, you know, more straightforward relationship with the ballot box. I think it would encourage more people to take part if they felt they could go and vote for what they really wanted, without, you know, that fear of, you know, something. I'd rather people went and voted for what they wanted rather than vote against what they were trying to stop, if that makes sense.
How do you think a proportional representational system could impact the stability of government and coalition building?
So there is an argument by some people that proportional representation is more likely to result in hung parliaments and coalitions. Now, I do think that argument has been blown out of the water in recent years. You know, 2010, we had first past the post and a coalition government. You know, Theresa May, of course, went to the country in 2017 and then lost a majority and ended up having to be propped up by the DUP. Now, I do think that that argument of first past the post being stable government has pretty much become irrelevant as an argument. Proportional representation, you know, perhaps it would lead to more parties not getting an overall majority, but would that not therefore increase the cooperation that we have across politics and actually include more people in our politics? Because you would have those smaller parties suddenly being able to be, you know, taken more seriously. Because at the moment, sometimes I think that if you're the third party or the fourth party, you get cut out of the conversation on the general election because you don't matter, you're not going to be the government. Well, actually, if there's an expectation that this is a party that might well be part of the government, it gives them a fairer hearing. It also means that there's more accountability and then there's more scrutiny in their politics as well, which is a positive thing.
Do you think it would encourage more people to vote if we used proportional representation instead of first past the post?
I don't think that proportional representation on its own will be some magic pill that fixes all of the problems that we have with engaging the public in democracy and elections. But I think for some people, knowing that they could go and vote and, you know, either transfer their vote or that their vote would be weighted proportionately would give them more of a enthusiasm for voting. I think there's also a requirement on politicians and political campaigners to engage with the electorate as well, though. I don't think you can just say we'll bring in proportional representation and at that point everyone will be excited and engage in democracy and democracy will be healthier. Like, I don't think it's going to be some magic fix. I just want to be clear that we also need to look at things like accountability of politicians, recall rights, and that has improved in recent years, but how do we strengthen that? How do we ensure that the public feel like they can express their opinions and have it matter more than just at a ballot box every 4 or 5 years?
The trust between the politicians and the public is at an all-time low at the moment. For a big change like this, is it best to let the people decide through a national referendum?
So, I mean, the electoral system has changed in the last few years. The Conservative government has pushed through a change to mayoral elections and police and crime commissioner elections to take it from the alternative vote back to first past the post. And in my argument, a regressive change has been done just through primary legislation. So there's certainly a precedent that you wouldn't need to go to a referendum in the country to change the electoral system. I do think that most people probably don't think about electoral systems on their day-to-day. They might think about education funding, they might think about poverty or the NHS, they might think about all kinds of different moral issues, but I don't think the electoral system is something that's most people would give much thought to. So I think there's certainly a strong argument you could just do it through primary legislation. If a party puts it in the manifesto, wins the general election, they can implement it.
Excuse me, do you know much about the voting system?
No, not much. All I know about is only 2 parties I always get voted in, and that's it really.
No, I don't.
Not a lot, but some parts of it, yeah.
Only that it's rigged.
Do you think it works?
I don't think anything works at the moment.
As our journey comes to an end, we pose a crucial question. What kind of electoral system best represents the values and aspirations of the United Kingdom? Ultimately, the decision between the first past the post and proportional representation goes beyond mere selection of representatives. It influences the future direction, upholds democracy, and ensures every voice is heard.